Thank you, Mr Speaker. Why do I feel like I've just sat through the public launch of Simon Bridges' autobiography? Mr Speaker, I'm very happy to stand and take a call on the third reading of this piece of legislation. I've checked my diary. Apparently it officially is the Honourable David Carter Day of Action today. He had a question in the House and a third reading speech, all within the space of 2 hours. Careful you don't get a nosebleed, Minister. That's a lot of work in one afternoon. And I think all that we can ascertain from that is there must be a cabinet reshuffle on the cards. There must be a cabinet reshuffle on the cards. But I want to congratulate the Minister, David Carter. It takes a lot of gall to be able to sit there in front of the man whose private members' bill you stole and to regale yourself with such eloquence as the Honourable David Carter did. And I want to commend the member Simon Bridges, who did all the work for this. We heard the long story of the build-up of this piece of legislation, how he was approached to deal with this very important issue. He developed the bill, he took it through his caucus, he put it into the ballot, it was drawn from the ballot, and then, with the sniff of a cabinet reshuffle inside, it was stolen off him by the Honourable David Carter. Unbelievable. But it is a very good piece of legislation. Of course, Labour is happy to support it at its third reading. I'm not quite sure what noises are emanating from the backbenches of the government, but I think I will just.
It was Sandra County. It was a dog.
I think I will just ignore them. Mr Speaker, this bill is very important because we have had a long history in New Zealand of inadequate penalties for animal cruelty. It takes about $10,000 to prosecute a case for animal cruelty. It can take a number of years for that case to be taken through. And as compared to 20 years ago, when a third of the cases were taken by the police, now the SPCA are finding themselves having to take 90% of the cases, and that is undoubtedly a heavy load for a voluntary organisation like the SPCA. And as other members have already said, I put on record our thanks to the SPCA for the good work they do in our country, the good work they have done and the good work that they will continue to do. We're pleased to see more funding that will be going to the SPCA to assist this and to prosecuting animal cruelty in general. $8 million is a good amount of money, Minister, but again, as my colleague Damien O'Connor pointed out, it has to be put in context. $40 million for private schools. Suddenly the $8 million for prosecuting animal cruelty doesn't look quite so much like the generous appropriation that the government are trying to make out that it is. Mr Speaker, one of the points that Labour has been making throughout the course of this entire debate is that doubling the penalties for animal cruelty is a good idea, but if you're not going to make sure it is adequately resourced, then that's not going to mean a single thing. And historically, with 0.4% of animal cruelty cases going to conviction, 0.4%, I think it's fair to say that there's very little disincentive away from animal cruelty when you look at the fact that 99.6% of cases never end up going to conviction. So the resourcing for this will be absolutely critical. And as I said before, we're pleased to see more resourcing go into this. And we certainly hope that this piece of legislation will result in much tougher penalties for cases of animal cruelty. We certainly hope it will result in more cases being taken through to conviction. Mr Speaker, there were some interesting changes made at the Select Committee during the course of the bill. And I think in terms of the bill in general, one of the interesting parts of it is the introduction of reckless ill-treatment of animals versus willful ill-treatment of animals. And one of the big problems in animal cruelty cases has been the necessity to prove intent. And of course, that's difficult enough to do when you're talking about human beings who can tell you what happened. It's virtually impossible to do when it comes to animals to ascertain intent, which was an important part of the requirement under the law. So the piece of legislation draws a distinction between willful ill-treatment and reckless ill-treatment. Obviously, willful ill-treatment, if it can be proven, is a much stronger offence. But I certainly would not like to see the gap between those two opening up wide. I would hate to see that reckless ill-treatment of animals suddenly becomes by default exactly the position we've got now, conjuring very low penalties, which is the problem we have now. because even though the penalties under the law that we have now are not even being used to their full extent. So doubling them is good, but unless we actually see decent penalties being handed out, and I certainly hope that those who are in the position to hand out those penalties are noting the fact that Parliament is speaking with one voice on this piece of legislation. We are saying very clearly to the courts we want to see much tougher penalties for animal cruelty and mistreatment of animals. But I would hate to see this clause of reckless ill-treatment of animals, which is a very good clause because it now opens up a whole area for convictions that were very difficult to get in the first place. But if we're just going to end up again with not many of them going through or very, very low penalties, then reckless ill-treatment of animals may just end up being a kind of, by proxy, way of keeping the status quo which we have now, which is ineffectual penalties. And ineffective penalties, sorry, Mr. Speaker. And that is particularly important because it may well be that we know that the ill-treatment was willful. We know that it was intended, we just can't prove it. So reckless ill-treatment of animals may well be taken for very serious cases, and it's good that those cases will be able to be taken. But I would hate then to see the penalties under that clause being seen as being very low because Parliament intended that reckless means that someone didn't mean to do it or was just being slightly negligent. It may actually not be the case. It may be that it was very willful ill-treatment. It was just that test couldn't be met under the law. Mr. Speaker, the other interesting work that the Select Committee did was around the forfeiture of animals, and this is always a very difficult area when you're deciding who should and who shouldn't own animals, and when people move animals around between different owners in order to try and evade the law. I think the Select Committee came up with a very sensible way of dealing with this, which is to say, well, clearly if someone mistreats an animal and that animal is on their property but they don't own it, and the owner is in fact a very good animal owner who has no history of ill treatment, then why would we take the animal off that owner when in fact they may not have known about it, they may not have had anything to do with it, and clearly the Select Committee didn't want that unintended consequence carrying through. But this clause, of course, is very interesting because not that long ago in this House we had quite a robust and divisive debate about microchipping of animals. And when I read through this part of the legislation through the Select Committee comments on it, I thought how far we've come from those days when we had the Honourable David Carter, probably Shane Ardern, screaming at us about what a terrible idea microchipping of animals was. It was dreadful, it wasn't going to work. What, is the Minister going to repeal microchipping? No, because that would be doing three things in one day, and I think that's completely out of the question. But the fact is that a lot of what this bill is relying on, is that we know who the owners of animals are and that we're able to trace them back. And the Minister doesn't seem to think that knowing who the owner of an animal is important when you have a clause which is about taking the animal off that owner. I suspect that if you're able to go back and if the Minister was taking an animal off someone who had mistreated it and that member had said, oh no, well, I don't actually own that animal, the Minister's saying it's not useful to have a microchip which says, well, actually you do because you're the registered in the animal, Minister, in the animal. Feel free to microchip any members of your caucus if you feel that's necessary. I was talking about microchipping the animals, not the owners. The fact is that we've come a long way from that debate on animal microchipping, which is allowing the SPCA to actually track animals in a way they couldn't before, is allowing the animal control officers to track animals in a way they haven't before. And the members on the other side of the House who are now taking advantage of that situation, who are frothing at the mouth when we suggested that we try and track animals so that we know where they are, what their history is, and so that we're able to deal with that, have now done a complete turnaround and in a complete kind of have tried to forget history in its entirety. And I just thought that was on the third reading important to point that out. It's great that we've all come together once again. On this issue. Mr. Speaker, this is a very important piece of legislation. I hope that it will make a significant difference, and I thank the member Simon Bridges for bringing it to the House.
I call Sue Kinsley.